the president is saying, no, I'm perfectly fine, it would take a 2/3 vote in the House and a 2/3 vote in the Senate to say the president is really unable to discharge the powers and duties of office.
What do you say to someone who says there seems to be a fairly pressing and dire crisis the country's going through, a crisis of democratic legitimacy, a kind of crisis of the rule of law and its institutions, whether they will hold. So far, they are holding. Although we have someone anonymously telling us they're sort of subverting the will of the president in the White House. And what you're describing is a kind of a Rube Goldberg machine that after like a boot kicks a ball and lands in a bucket and hits a spring, that maybe we get out of it when the crisis seems on the doorstep.
But Chris, that's what the rule of law is. We're a democracy, and we take our presidential elections seriously. I mean, Bill Clinton was impeached but not removed from office. Nobody's ever been removed under impeachment. We know there have been a lot of high crimes and misdemeanors, and so it's got to be a very extreme situation. And the Constitution's set up that way, but the 25th Amendment is part of the Constitution. It was passed by an overwhelming bipartisan vote. Senator Birchby led it. Robert F. Kennedy was his lieutenant in saying this is a critical thing for us to do. And so why would we not want to put a process in place in the event that this president or any other president really has a crisis in office? And so, all joking aside, mental health is a very serious business.
Sure.
And we don't want to be in a situation where the president is deranged and we've got nothing that we can do about it.
That's a good point, Congressman Jamie Raskin. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
For more on this truly extraordinary day, I'm joined by Shelley Holiday, Wall Street Journal reporter, Chris Liu, former Deputy Secretary of Labor in the Obama administration, had a bunch of positions in that office, and MSNBC contributor Tim O'Brien, executive editor of Bloomberg Gadfly and Bloomberg View, and author of Trump Nation. Did I pronounce that correctly? Trump Nation. A longtime Trump chronicler, Tim, you are. There's this problem with the president I call the adverb problem, which is constantly saying he's increasingly unmoored, increasingly unhinged, seems things increasingly chaotic. It's like we've been saying that for 2 years, and yet all those things do seem true at this moment.
Well, I can help you with that. It's not increasingly. He has always been thus. He has been this way since he was a teenager. Donald Trump is a 72-year-old man, and he's spent decades in the public eye, and he has always been profoundly self-absorbed and solipsistic. He has not been a self-disciplined or strategic and sophisticated thinker. He is someone who sort of eats the people around him alive. It happened in the Trump organization. It happened in the Trump campaign. It's now happening in the White House. None of this is new. We're just putting clothing on it. And I think this sort of momentum around he's increasingly becoming X, Y, or Z isn't really useful, because I think the reason behind it is people observing him are trying to figure out where is he going. And he's not going to go anywhere. He's going to be exactly who he is. He lives in his own bubble.
That's right. There's some sort of narrative need that things are building towards something.
Right, because it's difficult to explain, and people are struggling for explanations because it is so profoundly out there, everything that's going on.
But politically, I think the question is, what impact will an op-ed like this have? And the thing is, voters already knew all of these things. Voters already knew that he changes his mind from 1 minute to the next, that he engages in these rambling rants, that he has little regard for the free press or the free markets. You watch one rally, you already know all of these things. Right. So the question is, there are Trump supporters who are frustrated that unelected officials in the Trump administration are trying to undermine his agenda, which people rightfully voted for. But secondly, does this, we can only guess at the motive. Does this mobilize voters? Does this send a smoke signal to Congress? Is the motive to just give a giant middle finger to the boss? We don't really know, but we are already seeing the implications. We're already seeing the reaction from President Trump, and he's furious. So if the point of this op-ed is to express quiet resistance, for the benefit of the country, we're here in the administration putting the country first, it's hard to see how this accomplishes that.
Well, that I agree with. Chris, there's a certain amount of, some of the stuff being described and some of the stuff that happens in a White House or any complex organization is that people try to impose their will on the organization in all kinds of ways. I mean, the boss says do X, and you're like, oh, totally, absolutely. And then you just quietly move that to the background and don't do it. So what's being described, compare what's being described in this op-ed to what you experienced in the White House.
Well, it's fair to say in the Obama White House, we never discussed the 25th Amendment. We never stole paper off the president's desk so he wouldn't sign it. We never wrote anonymous op-eds. And what I do want to disagree with, Chris, is those people who are criticizing the op-ed writer. I do think it takes a significant amount of courage to have written this op-ed. We know that the identity of this person will likely be found. We know that this is a vengeful president. We know that the right wing will go after this person hard. But I don't think it serves the purpose, because whether it is this op-ed, whether it's Gary Cohn stealing papers off the president's desk, ultimately those are good things if we've stopped bad policy actions from happening. But it's not the job of political appointees to save the republic. It's the Congress. And as long as these people are enabling the president, Congress could keep its head buried in the sand and never have to take action. And as you've pointed out, we're having a Supreme Court nomination today. So for all of the fire and fury about what might be happening inside the White House, the president's about to get his second lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court.
You know, I regardless of how we end up considering the motives or whether or not this writer is admirable, one thing I think we have to take away from this is this notion that they pondered the 25th Amendment, but then moved away from that because they thought in invoking it, they would create a constitutional crisis. And that is almost beside the point. This White House is already in crisis. When you have a group of unknown, unelected officials taking over the reins of the executive office and then deciding on their own to determine how things are going because they got a president who they consider to be inept and someone who doesn't respect the rule of law, you are in crisis.
Mm-hmm. And what is described in the op-ed as crisis, and to be clear here, Shelby, is that the op-ed's not a lone data point. There's an enormous amount of data points now. You have the Michael Wolff book, the Omarosa book, right? And you can say
decades of Trump's own personal history. This was not a surprise. I don't really know that voters had a good idea of how unhinged Donald Trump is. I think they're progressively becoming more aware of that.
Right.
I think that's true. I think what could be different about this op-ed, and I was speaking to some Democrats and Republicans earlier, is that it could mobilize voters and it could demobilize Republican voters, keeping them home. There are a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump and said, we like what's happening in the country, we like what's happening with the economy, with taxes, with jobs. We do not like what comes out of the president's mouth. We don't necessarily support his more controversial comments and policies. But regardless, there are people who are still willing to vote for him or vote for people who will support his agenda. If this op-ed resonates with them, if they realize that this is such a critical moment and it's coming from somebody within the White House, they might stay home. That's Republicans' biggest fear in the midterm.
It's a good point about this sort of, people talk so much about the Trump base. Obviously, Trump base is going to dismiss this, but there are marginal voters, right? There's marginal voters who are making a marginal decision about which party to vote for, about whether to bother voting or not in their local race. And Chris, it does strike me that, I mean, again, the political stakes here are high.
Well, exactly, and I think Senator Murphy said it well. He didn't want to be apocryphal, but this election we have in less than 2 months is really about our democracy. And what you see is that voters want a check on this president, because right now you have a Republican Congress that's not willing to do that. They'd rather bury their head in the sand, get their tax cuts passed, get their conservative judges through, instead of protecting these guardrails of democracy.
Who has bested Trump in his time? Who has outlasted him?
Everyone who's done a business deal with him. He's gotten taken for a ride on most of his major business deals. His wives have outlasted him. His children have hung in there.
Yeah.
But you
have to endure a lot, though. I mean, that's the key thing, right? Like, that's his superpower.
Well, I mean, he's loyal to a very small number of people, and he's a survivor. And he's really happy as long as he's the center of attention. He doesn't care about outcomes.
Yeah, and you see that. Boy, it's a weird. It's like getting your worst dream fulfilled and then having to live it every day. It's a nightmare. Shelby Holiday, Chris Liu, and Tim O'Brien, thank you. That is all in for this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thanks, my friend. Much appreciated. Thanks to At Home for joining us this hour. In 1962, director John Frankenheimer made The Manchurian Candidate, one of the all-time classic American political thrillers. Frank Sinatra as the hero, Angela Lansbury as the creepiest mother who's not in a horror movie, Lawrence Harvey as the brainwashed communist plant who's inserted into U.S. politics at the highest levels. It's one of the greatest American movies ever, as far as I'm concerned. The original, obviously, not the remake. 2 years after The Manchurian Candidate came out, the same director, John Frankenheimer, came out with 7 Days in May. This movie was made in 1964, but because it was thought of as dealing with such a sensitive subject, They actually set it in the future. They set it about a decade in the future, in the 1970s, to try to not freak people out quite so much about the plot that's in the movie potentially unfolding right then and there in the United States in the early 1960s. 7 Days in May is another classic, scary American political thriller. It's about the U.S. military rejecting civilian control of the military. The U.S. president in the movie, he signs a nuclear disarmament treaty with the Soviet Union, and the Senate ratifies it, and military leaders freak out and decide they disagree with that so strongly that the leaders of the U.S. military plan to launch a coup. And drama ensues. As Americans, we've got a great pantheon of these great, dark American political thrillers. These movies and books that simultaneously freak us out and also serve the constructive purpose of spelling out the kinds of outlandish dangers and threats we might, maybe, conceivably need to protect our country against someday. Right? At the very, very edges of our Constitution, at the very edges of what we might imagine is possible within U.S. history. Here's another, though, that I think ought to be thought of in the same breath as Manchurian Candidate and 7 Days in May. It's called Night of Camp David. It was actually written by the same guy who wrote 7 Days in May. That was the one about the military coup. Had John Frankenheimer made a movie based on this book, Night of Camp David, like he did with 7 Days in May, and like he did with Manchurian Candidate, Night at Camp David, I think might be another one of those cultural touchstones we all now know about even decades later, a movie that still entertains us, but also gives us a sort of cultural vocabulary for talking about what otherwise might be kind of hard to imagine threats that might someday arise around a U.S. presidency. In Night of Camp David, which is the book, not a movie, not nearly as well known, the serious problem that befalls the presidency and the country in that book is that the president goes nuts. An otherwise unremarkable senator from the president's own party figures out that the president is going nuts because the president repeatedly invites him up to Camp David for late-night chats at Camp David. And in those chats, the president very dramatically turns out all the lights and sits there in the dark. And he rants and raves, and he tells this senator all his destructive, secret, paranoid fantasies. He tells this senator his rather insane plans for the country and the world, some of which seem like they might not be things that the president's ruminating about. Some of these things the president has actually started to hint at and make mention of in public, but nobody is taking it too seriously yet, and the senator realizes, oh, wow, people better take this seriously. This is the book when it came out in paperback. Obviously, the big headline there, or the big title there, Night of Camp David. But if you look up at the top, you see the Grab the Reader subhead right at the top. What would happen if the president of the USA went stark raving mad? Well, it's fiction. I'm not going to tell you what happens. It does have a very snappy ending, I can promise you. But here's what the New York Times said in their book review when Night of Camp David came out in 1965. They said the portrayal of an apparently mentally incompetent president was, quote, a little too plausible for comfort. Our hero senator's, quote, dilemma, as he discovers when he tries to enlist the help of some elder statesman in Washington, is that the president turns out to be a borderline case in terms of his mental infirmity. The Times asks in their review, quote, at what point is the president's pathology obvious enough to justify action? And who gets to make the decision? Who does get to make the decision? Previously unimaginable things keep happening now in our politics, in the White House specifically. And unprecedented behavior by a U.S. president means literally and specifically that we don't know of any historical examples of any other president ever behaving this way, right? And that's not only job, but we believe knows they suggest that specific dark war.
Value of your new car, you're better off throwing your money right into the harbor.
On NBC.
Self in the third person. This is someone.
They wouldn't say
And that is
sabotaging.
saves the
They would
president.
say
That saves the country from the president.
preserving the country's national security.
But if you have to be there, or it doesn't happen, or the president will cause damage, then what they're doing is is undermining and sabotaging. Yeah.
It's a cover-up. And you should go to Congress. You should go to, I mean, the other problem is that the committees in Congress that used to be the bipartisan sort of security net, safety net for our national security agencies are broken. I mean, where would you go? Would you go to the House